Reading this morning comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, continuing this story of blindness and seeing that we've been reading through Mark in the last few weeks. Picking up in chapter 10 at verse 46 of Mark. Jesus and his disciples came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The word of the Lord. All right. Who let the cat out of the bag? Throughout the entire Gospel of Mark up to this point, Jesus has taken great pains to keep his identity as the Messiah a secret. He doesn't want the word out yet. Didn't matter whether it was a demon he was casting out or his own disciples who identified him as the Messiah. Jesus had the same response. Tell no one anything. So I have two questions for us today. And the first is a pretty basic one. How did blind Bartimaeus, a blind beggar on the streets of Jericho, know, first of all, that Jesus was in fact the Messiah? He knew, he understood, right? He calls him the Son of David. That was a messianic title, reserved for the one, that anointed one that God would send to rescue his people, that descendant of David. But how did Bartimaeus know that Jesus was that one? Now, in popular theology of the day, that Messiah was what I described to the children, a conquering king who would come riding in on a great stallion leading armies to overthrow the oppressors, in this case, the mighty Roman Empire. Jesus, of course, had tried to explain to his own disciples that he was a different sort of Messiah, that this was not what he had come to do. He rather was the suffering servant of Isaiah, who came not to overthrow the Romans, but to overthrow our slavery to sin, to free us to love God as God loved us. But the disciples, as we saw last week, represented by James and John, were blinded by their dreams of glory. They wanted to be part of that conquering kingdom. They wanted to sit at the right and left of Jesus and wield that power over the former oppressors. They wanted nothing to do with the suffering servant. Yet maybe that's just it, isn't it? Maybe that's exactly what gave Bartimaeus his insight. Because he had, in fact, suffered greatly. He had, as we can tell by this passage, been able to see. He wanted to be able to see again, right? Instead, he had lost his sight, lost whatever life he had before that. Whatever job he had held, whatever way he had managed to make his way in life, he was now a beggar on the street. He knew suffering. But that suffering gave him insight, didn't it? Where the disciples were blinded by glory, he was allowed to see. It's like hiking in the spring and summer when you're out in the mountains and you can't hardly see past your own immediate view, right? You've got the trees, the lushness of life blinds you to all that is around you. You don't see the big picture. But in the wintertime, in the scarcity and darkness of life, those leaves are gone. And you see the big picture. When the lushness of life is gone, you see the reality of life in its barrenness and its starkness. And you see where it's going. You see that valley of the shadow of death. You can't pretend it's not there. You can't get lost in the lushness of the leaves. You see it all too clearly. And yet, if you keep looking, you can also see beyond that, can't you? You can see the mountain on the other side, the hope that we have of that new life. Perhaps that's what Bartimaeus saw. Perhaps he was in that winter of life. He was deaf. He was blind, but he wasn't deaf. He could hear those stories that were being told about Jesus. And he could see in him the hope that Jesus brought to the world. And realize that this was indeed the Messiah, the Son of David, the chosen one. Where everyone else was blind to what it meant, he knew, he could see, he could understand. In a society that so often blamed people for their troubles, he would have been told he was being punished for some sin. He had heard about that Jesus who ate with sinners and brought sight to the blind. And so he called out to him as the Son of David. So that answers my first question. All right. How did he, a blind man, not in the inner circle, know that Jesus was the Messiah? It was his suffering. His suffering, his own blindness, gave him that insight. That curse turned into a blessing. And that's no small point, is it? Because at some point in life, if we live long enough, we will all face such trials. We will all face such winters when the lushness of life falls away and we're left in the barren, cold world. And we will see the valley of the shadow of death. But like Bartimaeus, can we look beyond that? Can we hear the call to look and see that mountain beyond? And turn to God, not in bitterness, not in cynicism, not in lashing out, why thee, why me? But instead be drawn closer to God and in fact turn to Christ as the one who can save us. That's the curse turned into a blessing. But there's another question I have. Why didn't Jesus tell Bartimaeus, as he had told everyone else who identified him as the Messiah, to be silent, to not tell anyone? Well, look at it this way. What did Jesus see when he looked at Bartimaeus? I'm talking about what Bartimaeus saw, but what did Jesus see? Well, he obviously didn't just see a blind beggar. He saw so much more. In fact, he saw someone who, despite, or perhaps because of his suffering, understood who he was. Didn't just know he was a Messiah, but understood that he came to heal, that he came to bring peace and reconciliation. who understood he was the son of David, but even though he didn't have conquering armies. In other words, Jesus perhaps was given hope in this man, that through suffering people would finally understand. Now think about it. Jesus has been with these disciples 3 years, and they still don't get it. They're still wanting to sit at his right and left in glory and wield that power and be all these mighty people. He has taught, 3 times he's told them what's going to happen in Jerusalem, that he is going to suffer, and they're still not getting it. And yet here, in this blind Bartimaeus, a man who simply heard the stories, but who has suffered, he has seen and understood. Jesus now, maybe for the first time, has assurance, some hope, that his mission to that cross that he's known about for so long will not be in vain, that his suffering will finally bring understanding, that his disciples, after they experience that darkness when he's arrested, that gloom and despair and fear when he dies on the cross, but then the joy of the resurrection, that then finally they will understand. They will not only know he's the Messiah, but they will finally get it. And so he goes on. He doesn't tell Bartimaeus to be quiet, and he knows what that means. The people will expect him to be the conquering Messiah. He will disappoint that expectation. They will turn on him. He knows what's coming. But now he's seeing how that suffering can bring understanding and bring the very peace and bring people to turn their lives to God, to him, as Bartimaeus did. So it is time. So Bartimaeus understood because his suffering gave him insight. Jesus did not silence him because he saw in Bartimaeus a confirmation of the power of his pending sacrifice and what the suffering would allow, it would bring understanding. But that raises a third question. What does Christ see when he looks at his church? I mean, we're just as subject as those disciples to get caught up in the hunt for glory. And yet we're just as likely as Bartimaeus to meet trials and tribulations in this life. So what does Christ see? Does our suffering bring bitterness, cynicism, doubts that drive us away? Or does it free us to turn to Christ? Does he see us like Bartimaeus, blind as we often are? I mean, I don't know all the answers. None of us do. There's a good chance we don't and may never understand why we have to endure a particular suffering. We can be blind to the cause. Yet we have all heard, like Bartimaeus. And will we, like him, refuse to be quiet? And instead of turning away, instead of going our own path, call out all the more loudly when the world tells us to be quiet, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on us. Let all God's people